welcome everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I know there are a few people coming in, and so we'll continue to welcome them as they join us. And as we get settled in, please make sure to keep your microphones muted, but we welcome you to keep your cameras on if you would like during the colloquium. That gives us a sense of community and connection. And you all know that in theater, whether performing or talking about theater, being able to at least get some visual feedback from your audience that A, they exist, B, they're awake, C, they're informed or engaged in what you're doing is super helpful. So if you want this conversation to go well, then you are definitely a part of it as a part of the audience. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the virtual colloquium series, In Conversation, Arts and Culture for Well-Being, organized by the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is James Pawelski. I am Professor of Practice and Director of Education in the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, and the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to those who are joining us live and to those who are watching the recorded version of today's event. The mission of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is to understand, assess, and advance the well-being benefits of engagement in arts and culture, focusing on individual and collective human flourishing. We're grateful for support from the Chris and Sasha Heinz Family Foundation, the Heinz Endowments, and the National Endowment for the Arts, which has designated the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project as an NEA research lab and is supportive both of practice-informed research and of research-informed practice in the arts, culture, and well-being. You can find out much more about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, including our publications and how to sign up for our newsletter on our website at www.humanities-and-human-flourishing.org. Thank you, Sarah, for having put that link in the chat. Today, we are thrilled to continue with the fourth installment of In Conversation, part of the HHF Colloquium series, featuring presentations by and discussions among scientists and practitioners on topics concerning the arts, culture, and well-being. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers for today, let me preview the plan for this colloquium. We will begin by hearing two 20-minute presentations, one focusing on science and one focusing on practice. Then I will moderate a brief discussion with the speakers before opening it up to a Q&A with all of you. At any point during the session, feel free to enter questions or comments in the chat. If you would like to share these verbally, we would ask you to wait until we open it up for audience participation toward the end of our time together. And at that time, you can raise your Zoom hand to be a part of the conversation. Okay, with that, let's turn to our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Thalia R. Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is an associate professor of psychology at George Mason University and director of the Social Skills, Imagination, and Theater Lab, as well as a National Endowment for the Arts lab, the Mason Arts Research Center. Her research focuses on how children, adolescents, and adults can learn from social and emotional skills through engaging in pretend, imagined, and theatrical worlds, as well as how individuals understand characters in such worlds, such as Santa Claus. Intriguing. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, and published in Child Development, Trends in Cognitive Sciences and Developmental Science, among others. She is currently co-editor of the American Psychological Association journal, Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. The title of her talk today is Theatrical Thinking, the Habits of Mind Taught in Acting Class. Please join me in welcoming Thalia Goldstein.
Hello, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And, as with all Zoom talks, can everybody hear me? Can everybody see my screen? Yes, I'm all set. Okay, great. So I'm not going to be talking about Santa Claus today. I'm very sorry to disappoint, but I'm always happy to talk about Santa Claus under other circumstances. So feel free to reach out if there are questions that you have about how to talk to your kids. So today I'm going to be talking about work that we've been doing in my lab on the habits of mind that are taught in acting class. So as most of us know in this audience, the connections between acting, theater, and a variety of social and emotional outcomes are theoretically old and quite deep. In fact, for as long as there has been writing on Western theater, scholars, theorists, actors, practitioners have tried to figure out what it does for human psychology, why it exists, why we like it so much, how it continues, and what it does for us. And I'm here with some good news, which is that in the last 20 years or so, there has been a real flourishing, if you will, of science on this question of what does acting do? What does engagement in theater do for the development of social and emotional skills, as well as cognitive skills such as memory and language? However, there is some bad news to be said as well, which is despite these many publications, some from my lab, some from others' labs, there are some fundamental issues. These include a lack of replication depending on what kind of program you're involved in. It involves differences between groups of children and adults who are engaging in acting and theatrical activities, a lack of reliability in the measurement of these kinds of activities, and in fact, I would argue a lack of theorizing about what actually happens in an acting classroom or theater experience that may be mechanistically or causally involved in the kinds of psychological outcomes that we all have a philosophy or a sense of, but not really a firm scientific evidence base for. So to my eyes, this forms sort of as a whole a question of what are the foundations of acting classes and theater experiences that are involved in causing social and emotional outcomes. To put it more schematically, the question that I'm asking is how does theater lead to flourishing when there are so many other variables involved? So under theater, there's not just one kind of theater. There are a multitude of varieties of theatrical experiences. And then when we're talking about flourishing, there's not just one way to flourish. There are multiple different varieties of psychosocial, emotional, and cognitive skills and habits that are involved in leading a good and fruitful life. And of course, this relationship between theater and flourishing can be affected by all sorts of other variables, including the demographics of the population that are involved in the theatrical experiences, the contexts under which they are engaged in these theatrical experiences, and any other number of mechanistic questions that you might want to ask. So for my lab and in our work, this presents a puzzle. If we want to make the claim that engagement in acting classes cause varieties of flourishing, like social and emotional skills or social and emotional learning, things like empathy, theory of mind, compassion, understanding of others, perspective taking, we have to ask a whole bunch of sub-questions. These questions include which activities in theater, which skills are we affecting? For whom are we causing these changes? How are we causing these changes? And why is theater particularly good at causing changes? In order to try and answer these questions, my lab has been involved. Oh, I'm sorry. The last question was when? When do you have to be involved in these theater experiences in order to allow for these later changes? So in order to try and start to answer some of these questions, my lab has been involved in studies that take a wide scientific view on the idea of acting classes and outcomes. We've been engaged in everything from real-world observations, where we actually go into acting classes and conduct psychological analyses, to program evaluations of different kinds of acting programs, to field experiments where we randomly assign children to engage in theater or in other kinds of activities and see what happens, to actual experiments in the lab where we bring kids into our lab and have them engage in different kinds of activities to see what immediate effects they have. Today, I'm going to focus in on the real-world observation that my lab has been conducting for the last 3 years to try and get at this foundational question of how. What are the activities within theater that may be causing outcomes? And we call this study theatrical thinking, because what we're particularly interested in is when you look at the acting classes that students are actually engaging in across the United States, you can analyze them in a few different ways in order to figure out what might be fostering, promoting, using, and integrating a variety of skills that students can then use outside of the acting classroom. So we've been looking at acting classes in terms of what are the actual activities that are taking up the time in the acting classroom itself, and then what are the habits of mind, the dispositional thinking strategies, the problem-solving strategies that are being taught in acting classes that could possibly be leading to some of these cognitive, social, and emotional effects we've seen in our other findings, in our other studies. So in order to conduct this study, we went to 5 different schools across the United States that were engaged in acting classes for high schoolers. So these are students between the ages of 14 and 18 years old in 9th through 12th grades. In the first school, we went to a private stage from October of 2017 to March of 18, located in a suburban town in the eastern United States. This is an after-school conservatory, meaning students had to audition to get in and then engaged in about 10 hours a week of after-school acting programs. We were in that school for about 16 hours. Then we filmed at a public arts academy, a magnet school in a large city on the eastern seaboard. Again, we were in there for 16 hours. These students had to audition to get into this school and in fact majored in theater while they were in the school. We also filmed at an all-girls school, again, a suburban school that this school was private, all girls, and they were taking their acting classes as an elective. We were there for 10 hours. Then we were in a rural district on the West Coast. You can see that the date here is March 2020. I literally had to have my master's student on March 14th of 2020 leave a rural town in Northern California in the middle of the night to get back home in time before they canceled all the flights. So that was the end of our data collection. And then we were also in a large suburban school district, also in March of 2020. This one, we finished data collection on March 7th, so we were doing better there. But as you can see, we have a variety of 3 suburban, 1 urban, and 1 rural school, 2 public, 2 private, 1 magnet school, for a total of about 56.5 hours of filming. I will note that these schools, some of them were majority Black and Hispanic students, some had a plurality of Hispanic and Indigenous students, and other schools were majority white and Asian schools. So we do have a variety of demographics among the students in these schools, as well as in the teachers. So when we looked at these films, these 56 hours and a half of films, what we first did was we subjected them to a time course analysis, meaning we looked at what the kinds of activities were that students were engaged in every class across every school. And what we found is an acting class consists of 4 components. The first are preparation components. These are things like vocal warm-ups, physical warm-ups, and explanations of what the students are going to be engaged in over that day. The second time segment were generation segments. This will be very familiar to the improvers in the room, but these were group and individual improvisation exercises, viola spolin style games, and other kinds of generated material based off of prompts. The third kind of activities were reflection activities. This is when students were engaged in discussion and critique, And this discussion and critique could be about the class as a whole, as it could be about their own lives, but it could also be about the preparation activities they had just engaged in or the generation activities that they had just engaged in. Or it could be about our fourth segment. Our fourth segment were interpretation activities. Now, for those of you with less theater experience, this may have been what you thought an acting class was to begin with, right? Which is that you have a script and you engage in scene study and character preparation. But what was particularly interesting to us as we began to do this time course analyses of the classes was how rarely interpretation was actually part of the class. So what you're looking at here is the time course of 5 sample classes, one from each of our schools. You can see that on the top level, we've got the private conservatory school class that was almost 2 hours long. They started with some reflection, then moved into a preparation activity, did some reflection of that, and then moved into a generation activity. They didn't engage in any scene study at all that day. In the Arts Academy, they had a similar beginning trajectory and then engaged in some interpretation activities at the end. With the girls' school, the big suburban school, and the rural district school, you can see that these acting classes are really much more about physical engagement and warm-up and generative engagement or improv than they necessarily are about the interpretation of somebody else's words. The preparation to learn how to become an actor is much more generative than it is necessarily interpretive. So from there, we then conducted a grounded theory analysis, which is a kind of systematic qualitative analysis in order to look at what habits of mind were being fostered, integrated, and used in these classrooms. So how we did this is we looked at every single statement that the teacher made over the course of the 56.5 hours of classes, and then tried to figure out what was it that the teachers were trying to get the students to do. What kind of domain general framings and approaches to the world were the teachers talking about? And how were the teachers fostering cognitive patterns and dispositional level thinking strategies? Habits of mind is not something that we made up for this study. This is a commonly used framing in education. And in fact, there's a wonderful book on visual arts called Studio Thinking, which talks about the habits of mind that are present in visual arts classes. And that study actually did inspire this theater study. Habits of mind can really be thought about the way to get students, the way to get kids to move from reproducers of knowledge and sort of memorization and spitting out knowledge to actual critical thinkers and critical producers of new knowledge. The idea is that these are problem-solving strategies that call upon lots of other social, emotional, and psychological skills. So what we found were 8 habits of mind that emerged in acting classes. So these are what I'm calling the 8 habits of mind. The first was body awareness and control. So this was really about, do you know where your body is in space and time? How about your body in relation to another person's body? How much are you giving out? How much are you keeping in? This also involved mindfulness training, right? And mindfulness-based stress reduction exercises. The second habit of mind that teachers used quite often in our classes was about imagine and envision. Think about the world that you are about to perform outside of the perceptual reality that you are currently engaged in. What would your character be like? What would the world be like if it was covered in molasses? What would your body feel like if you had 100-pound weights around your ankles? The third habit of mind that teachers came back to over and over again was to reflect and think metacognitively. An acting class is a quick back and forth that involves critique and reflection and changes as a result. So the students were constantly being told to think about what they were thinking about. The fourth is release inhibitions and be playful. Having self-judgment and being inhibited on stage is not what our acting teachers wanted. They wanted these students to sort of let go of themselves and act freely, which, considering all of our participants were adolescents, is a big ask, but absolutely core to the training. Being asked to think about Students were constantly being asked to think about the minds of their characters, the minds of the other characters in a script, the minds of the other people on stage when they were engaged in improv exercises, and their own minds in a third-person way. The sixth habit of mind is collaborate. Theater is necessarily a collaborative art. It requires students to work together, even in monologues. When the students were giving monologues, they were still being asked to think about the audience and to collaborate with the audience in order to make the best presentation. The seventh one was to commit to choices. Students, as all of us who have done theater, were learning that if you try to play 3 emotions simultaneously, or you're both trying to interact with and avoid somebody else on stage, the audience can't read what it is that you're doing. You have to make firm, definitive choices. Yet at the same time, you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to change your tactic, or change what you're thinking about or what you're doing in order to come up with the best outcome. So these were the 8 habits of mind that emerged from our grounded theory analysis of acting classes. And what I want to do now is just take 1 minute to talk about how we are now conceptualizing these habits of mind as being associated with different kinds of known and measurable psychological skills. So for example, body awareness and control, we saw in various acting exercises such as vowel ladders, where students had different vowels that were attached to different parts of their body, dance warm-ups where they just put on some music, guided meditations, and scripting verbs to music where they would walk around to music and try to physically portray anger or sadness. These kinds of exercises are connected to the psychological skills of emotion regulation, interoception, and embodied cognition, all of which tie the body and mind together in order to teach people how to understand and regulate their own emotions in a healthful way, in a way that can lead to better outcomes, because suppressing your emotions and not feeling them and ignoring what the signals your body is sending you is a bad idea for later psychological health. For consider others and collaborate, we saw exercises and the teachers saying things like, pay close attention and think about the truth underlying what somebody is saying, or making sure that the students understood that much of acting is just about listening. We saw them give group goals for warm-ups, like pass a ball in the air 100 times, or to encourage students to jump in and save partners when the improvisations weren't going well. These are all directly related to the psychological skills of theory of mind, empathy, and communication, where students have to learn what somebody else is thinking or feeling, how much they can match what somebody else is thinking or feeling, and how to let them know that they're on board or not. How am I doing on time, by the way? Sorry to interrupt myself, but I just want to make sure I don't take up anybody else's time.
You've got a couple of minutes, Thalia.
Amazing. I'm going great then. Awesome.
Perfect.
I can tell you all about release inhibitions and be playful. So we saw exercises and teacher statements about releasing inhibitions and being playful in things like the 1,000-year exercise, where students had to walk across the stage and pretend that it was taking them 1,000 years. These were 14 and 15-year-olds who did not want a group of people looking at them as they moved extremely slowly across the stage, but they had to release inhibitions and have a playful attitude in order to be able to do that exercise. Similarly, they played games of robot infection that you might otherwise see in 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 7-year-olds, but getting 15 and 16-year-olds to do it, again, playfulness and release of inhibitions. And then whoosh, bang, bridge, tunnel is a sort of send the energy around the circle game that often ended in peals of laughter. All of these are associated with psychological skills of self-efficacy and trust of the self, safe playfulness, and lowering of self-judgment. Again, these are all healthy skills for teenagers to learn as they develop and go through puberty into adulthood. Finally, reflection and metacognition. We had lots of quick feedback loops. We have examples of students being asked to journal. And then there were always these opening and closing circles to our classes where students were asked to reflect either on what had happened to them over the week or what had happened to them in the class. This is the center of learning. If you can't metacognate and reflect on what you're doing, it's really hard to learn new skills. Being able to know what you're doing and whether or not it's working is associated with changing. If you don't understand the behaviors you're engaged in, you can't change this. Now, of course, all of acting classes are hopefully leading many students to engage in scene study exercises. And what was key about scene study exercises is we saw all of our habits of mind played out in one segment of class. Anytime a student engaged in scene study, they had to do body control while they performed, reflect on whether it was working, think flexibly about what else they could do, consider whether that would be a choice that their character would make, imagine and envision what it would look like if they made a change, commit to that choice, release the inhibitions around that new choice, think about if the audience is going to buy it, and then perform with body control again. So around and around we go with scene study. And I would argue that if you're having students that are struggling with performing, it might be that they're getting stuck somewhere in this loop. And by isolating it and making it explicit, you can help students act. So taken all together, I think what we found in this study is some really interesting, preliminary framework for how we can start to think about all these connections we found previously in the empirical literature between acting classes and a variety of social, emotional, and flourishing outcomes, but also maybe where we've been sent awry and aren't looking at the foundations of how theater can be used flexibly across contexts. So in the future, we're going to start doing some short-term interventions with specific habits of mind in mind, some acting classes and looking at the differences between acting classes themselves and integrated dramas or drama-based pedagogies, and looking at younger groups and older age groups. Everybody I've talked to that works in creative dramatics in preschool and professional level actors sees some seeds of truth in these habits of mind. So I think they're relatively flexible across age group. So I just want to say, I think theater is a flexible toolkit that can be used widely across contexts. And these habits of mind that we've discovered in this analysis, I think can be applied across a very wide variety of students, ages, locations, and goals for the teachers. You just need teachers that know about them. And whether they have emotional goals or whether they have goals of flights of fancy, I think the habits of mind can be really core to how they build that out. So I want to just say a quick thank you to my funders for this work. None of this work happens alone. Thank you to the parents, children, and schools, to my lab, and to thank you all for listening.
Wow, Thalia, that was magnificent, fascinating. And you are now receiving a Zoom version of vigorous applause. So I hope you can see it, even if you can't hear it.
Thank you so much.
Really, really terrific and fascinating. Looking forward to digging into some of the things that you shared with us. For now, though, I want to introduce our second presentation. And our second presentation is going to be given to us by two speakers, Philip Chen and Meera Menon. Both are 2020 recipients of Penn's President's Engagement Prize. And together they co-founded the Unscripted Project, a nonprofit organization that brings free improv workshops to Philadelphia public school students. As a kid, Philip Chen experienced firsthand the power of receiving a drama education in building confidence, strengthening communication, and finding his voice. Philip co-founded the Unscripted Project to bring the transformative power of improv education to the lives of students within the classroom and beyond. Originally from Melbourne, Australia, he is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in finance, real estate, and cinema studies. Beyond Unscripted, Philip is also an investment banker at Credit Suisse and is an avid foodie and fan of independent cinema. Meera Menon, during her college education and in her career afterwards, has found that she could attribute many of the skills for success she learned, things like speaking with confidence, finding common ground, and building relationships, to her theater and improv experiences. Deeply passionate about education access and equity, she believes that unscripted and the arts more broadly have truly transformative power. Originally from the Bay Area, California, she is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in management, finance, and international development. Beyond unscripted, Meera currently works as a consultant at Bain & Company. She is an avid hiker and enjoys exploring the wilderness and New York City wine bars alike. So please join me in welcoming Philip Chen and Meera Menon.
Thank you, James, for that introduction. And thank you for having us. And firstly, Thalia, that was an amazing presentation. I cannot wait to engage in our conversation a little bit and to learn more about your work in the future as well. I think it's very aligned with the mission and the work we're trying to achieve in Philadelphia. Firstly, thank you, everyone. We just want to introduce ourselves briefly. As James mentioned, we're the co-founders of the Unscripted Project, which is a nonprofit based in Philadelphia that aims to foster social emotional development in the classrooms through a free 10-week series of improv classes. Meera, if you go to the next slide. Just want to start off with this quote from one of our 9th grade students. She said, "For the longest time, I've limited myself from taking risks. Through improv, I was able to take risks and be my true, authentic, silly self." So I wanted to start off with this quote because this is the essence of what we are trying to accomplish as a nonprofit. It is to allow our students some freedom and breathing room outside the structure and rigor of their education right now, and to learn how to be a human, to learn all of those skills that they may not have access to elsewhere. Before we move on to our formal talk, I do want to say that it's important to provide context on why we personally started this nonprofit. Me and Meera were very privileged growing up in that we went to schools that had an art-rich environment, which is not the case across many schools, especially public schools here in Philadelphia. And it was through the arts that we were exposed to theater classes, improv classes, and it's those experiences that as we grew up, went to college, and now in the workforce, then we reflect upon those are the skills and those are the experiences that we believed attributed to our success. It was in the theater classrooms we learned how to listen to others, to collaborate, to empathize, to literally step into someone else's shoes as characters. And those skills, or soft skills, as some would say, is what we attribute much of our success to, and is kind of the hypothesis for us starting the Unscripted Project. Moving on to our agenda, Meera. We just want to go through today intro to what we do as a nonprofit, what is improv for those who's not familiar with it, improv and research alongside it thus far, and some of the results we've seen in our program. So a quick intro to Unscripted. We are a bike park-led nonprofit here in Philadelphia, equipping students with the critical social emotional skills needed to succeed within and beyond the classroom. We do this through our core program, which is a 10-week in-school, in-class program that is offered for free. Usually we serve non-elective classrooms because our thesis is that students who self-select into a program like this may not get as much benefits as students who otherwise wouldn't have. We chose improv as our medium because improv has the lowest entry barriers of entry of any theater arts. You come as you are. We don't need anything apart from a classroom and the space itself. And students really just come as they are, and there's no prior preparation, no script, no costume. So the kids who are too cool to be in school usually join in by a couple weeks in. We started in 2020 during the height of COVID. We were virtual for our first semester and been in the classrooms ever since. We've been worked with over 1,300 students now in about 20 schools here in the Philadelphia School District. And yeah, we're marching forth and growing every year. So we're very excited to share some of our work and results with you all today. So a little bit more about the work we do and why we do it. So students are leaving schools unprepared for the real world. Communication, self-confidence, and other soft skills are not emphasized in many public school settings, despite it being critical for success afterwards. So in a school district survey, this is a Philly school district survey that was done a couple of years ago, 74 students identified they do not feel prepared for life post-graduation. And for us as big theater nerds and students who were impacted by the power of the arts, we believe that a practical theater and drama education that is often excluded by the core curriculums is very, very necessary to develop well-rounded students and human beings. So a little bit more about our core program. So it is a 10-week program. We offer it typically in a non-elective classroom. It could be an English class, it could be a homeroom class. We have even some like biotech elective classes.
We've been in a
we're
class.
in a little bit of everything. We serve middle school and high school students. So we go from the 6th grade to the 12th grade. And we offer for free for schools in the Philadelphia School District. We also run an Act 48 accredited professional development series of 4-hour workshop for teachers. They can earn credits through us as well. And we also work in corporate rooms. We work with companies, universities to offer workshops to their teams as well for a fee that supports our free programming. So moving on to the next slide. Just want to show you some of the pictures from our classes over the last year. Our program has been more impactful than ever in the last year because the aftermath of the global pandemic has really affected our students in these schools. Students you'll hear learning recovery as a big term in education. Students have not been socializing with each other. They haven't been in the classrooms. For those who are not familiar with some of the problems facing the Philadelphia School District, many students didn't even show up to class during the 2 years that school was virtual, and that continues to be an issue in school today. So really re-engaging students, re-energizing the classroom has a big emphasis of what the district is doing. It's also a big emphasis of our work in the classrooms. The silver lining in all this is us starting an improv program in 2020. We received huge adoption from the district, mainly because we were teaching students how to learn to adapt to uncertainty. Improv is something that is unscripted. You cannot plan for it, and none of us could have imagined what the world would have been like in 2020 and now. So learning how to adapt to uncertainty is a skill more necessary now than ever before. Through improv, as Thalia mentioned, theater is all about collaboration. It's about creating a piece of art together. Re-socializing students and creating community in the classroom is a big emphasis of our work today. And lastly, it is about re-engaging students with a love of learning. It's creating classroom environments where students feel happy and able to raise their hand, ask a question, or be comfortable with their peers. And we see those effects to be long-lasting and lingering in the classrooms well after we leave through our 10-week program. So moving on.
Oh,
yes.
sorry. I was just going to say, the only thing I would add is that we started during COVID. And so we had classes on Zoom. And there was this big question of, there is a subset of students who are able to join on Zoom. And of those subset of students, how are we engaging them? How are we encouraging them to turn on their cameras? How are we encouraging them to participate? It feels, and maybe you all can resonate with this as well, it feels much harder sometimes to ask a question over Zoom than it does in person. It becomes a much more sort of formal interaction. And so when we first started, a lot of this was also couched in, for the Zoom world, can we get students to turn their cameras on? And can we get students to participate and feel comfortable in this new environment? Since then, as you can see, we've thankfully been able to move in person, and we've been working with students after a year of Zoom learning, and that's why reconnection was a big theme of last year. So we're working with 6th graders, but in some ways, we're working with 4th graders or 5th graders because these are students who unfortunately missed out on some really formative experiences in the classroom. That's the other COVID context I would add there, but go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we'd love to give a quick primer on what is improv and why we chose it as the art form we wanted to bring into the classroom. So what is improv? So improv or improvisational theater is a performance art in which the actors or the performers do not rely on a script at all. So everything is made up on the spot. You may know it from the theaters in Chicago, like Second City, or TV shows like Whose Line Is It Anyway? Who is improv for? So that is the piece that really we were thinking about as we were starting this program. Improv is not just for actors or comedians or theater kids, but for us, it's a fundamental skill set for everyone. And education in improv helps us understand our own potential, help us navigate the world, and help us really able to connect to others as human beings. But I want to give a little context on the history of improv as well. So The lady on the left is Viola Spolin. She is often known as the pioneer of improv, the godmother of improv. Her sons later went on to found Second City, which is a super famous improv theater in Chicago. And on the top right is actually Hull House, an immigrant settlement house in Chicago. And the bottom are students and immigrants who are in that house living there, taking theater classes with Viola Spolin. So the origins of improv comedy can be traced back not to comedians, not to a theater, but rather a settlement house and an immigrant community where this lady Viola Spolin grew up and taught. So a little bit about the history of improv. So really at age 18, Viola Spolin studied under a sociologist called Neva Boyle, who was a sociologist at the Hull House here in Chicago. And it was a very progressive place for the time, I would say. They believed an education needed to be holistic. They believed to create well-rounded citizens, that the art was a very important part of an education. So at the Hull House, they had a bunch of programs that involves theater, play, storytelling, and all of these things. And Viola, who was a great lover of theater and games, developed a series of games to help children break down cultural, ethnic, racial, social, and economic backgrounds, and to help them really assimilate into American life. She had a great quote in her book that she said, if you're playing with other people, even across cultural barriers, to play with other people is an expression of equality and an expression of sharing. That's a quote I do love from her book. So she was working with these students for many, many years. And, a few decades on, she was to put together all the games and techniques she learned, and she developed into two really fundamental books of improv, which is Improvisation for the Theater and Theater Games for the Classroom. So the origin of improv always extended to the well-being of children. And in many ways, it is social emotional learning from the get-go. It's the basis of this art form, and just something that, is very cool and most people don't know about. So this is the reason why we chose improv as a tool to engage social emotional learning in the classrooms. Moving on to the next slide, we want to go through quickly the 5 main tenets of improv, and you can see that they're very similar to the skills that Thalia was mentioning about the habits of acting. These are the 5 biggest lessons you learn from improv, and the lessons that you learn basically in the first 10 weeks of doing improv, which is yes and, the 2 magic words of improv. To us, yes is an acceptance of someone else's idea or gift, and is how you add to it. So it's really that collaboration and building a story together. Act and react, as the nature goes, it's about listening and reacting to things. Look good by making your partner look good. Improv is all about collaboration. There is no such thing. Oh, the 5th one is there's no such thing as a mistake. So it's really about how we save your partner. It's how that create a story together and how you create something out of thin air. And the last one is be vulnerable. Improv is a very vulnerable art. You don't come prepared. You make things up at the spot and things can slip, but it's all about being authentic and letting your life inform the story that you're going to tell. So those are the 5 tenets of core tenets of improv that we really think can, as Thalia mentioned, change your habits, your mindset, and provide you a toolkit to succeed in your life beyond the classroom. And lastly, before I move on to Meera, is that the term improv has now kind of expanded into another term called applied improv. So there's many practitioners just like ours using improv as a tool rather than an end goal. We're not teaching our students to be great actors or comedians or improvisers, but rather using improv as a tool to provide them with the skills, techniques, confidence, all of those things that they need to succeed within and beyond the classroom. And there's actually now a formal definition of applied improv. It's the use of principles, tools, practices, skills, and mindsets of improvisational theater in non-theatrical settings that may result in personal development, team building, creativity, innovation, and/or meaning. There's actually a big network out there called the Applied Improvisational Network, called AIN, that it consists of both researchers, practitioners, and enthusiasts alike that really comes together to really share the benefits of improv to a wider audience, like what we are doing as well. And before I pass on to Meera, I would like to say that we put this together as a 10-week curriculum with each week focused on a very specific skill. So the first week is actually all about play and humor. It's, as Thalia mentions, that breaking down the inhibitions. It's allowing students to laugh And there's lots of power in that, in terms of collaboration, and how students feel comfortable and safe in that space. And each week progresses with a very specific life skill. So one week may be focused on collaboration, one week will be focused on point of view, another week will be focused on listening and acceptance, and it all wraps together out with a showcase at the end where students get to perform at a very low stakes kind of internal facing event. So that's how we've been, that's the basis of what we do. And I'll pass it on to Meera on some of the research and the results that we've been working on.
Thank you, Philip. I'll say that my favorite week of the curriculum is the storytelling week. So just to bring it to life a little bit, we start by playing a bunch of basic storytelling games, and we get to the crux of what makes a good story. And we talk about how enthusiasm is really important in telling a story, or details are really important in telling a story. Instead of saying, I ate breakfast this morning, it's, well, I tried to froth oat milk this morning for my coffee. It's about using the details and the enthusiasm to tell a compelling story. And then we're able to connect that to interviews as a real world application of how students might use these skills. So in the Philadelphia public schools, students are interviewing to be in the selective high schools. So in 8th grade, these 12 and 13-year-olds are being interviewed and asked to reflect about themselves and talk about their strengths and weaknesses. And so by playing really low stakes games, for example, a student interviewing to be a chicken nugget scientist, for example, they're able to hone those same skills of how am I pitching myself? What body language am I using? How am I using details in my story? Things like that. And that is just sort of an example of how these different pieces come together. But now I'll talk about what I'm actually meant to talk about, which is improv and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is a term that Philip and I have come across so much as we sort of explore this field. I will say Philip and I are novices to research and academia. It was something that we had hardly encountered during our time at Penn before we actually started working on Unscripted. So it's been really valuable to have mentors and friends kind of show us the ropes, and like, how do we even think about research? How do we even start asking the right questions? What does impact measurement mean? So for this next section, I would love to share sort of how we've been thinking about it from a practitioner's lens, but also welcome questions later on about, how did we get here, or what are our next steps? Because I will say there are many. One of the things that we developed in our sort of conception of Unscripted is a logic model, which is just, what are we actually doing? What are the short-term effects? And then what are the long-term outcomes that leads to? And at a very basic level, the way that Philip and I have been thinking about this, and our whole team has been thinking about this, is that improv training improves social emotional learning on a variety of dimensions. So think about in the research, we've seen things like social anxiety, creativity, self-efficacy, as well as expressiveness. And then we've also seen that these SEL improvements are linked to better student engagement, the ability to learn and apply academic content. And that then is what's linked to things like graduation rates, job placement, and things like that. So our goal is, are we able to build these really crucial soft or social emotional skills? And then how does that link to these outcomes in the real world that we're indexing on? James, quick question. How much time do I have? I realized I wasn't tracking.
Sorry, just getting unmuted. About a couple of minutes, Meera.
Okay, perfect. So I'll go through this piece rather quickly because I think Thalia will know much more about this. Thalia will know much more about this than Philip and I will. But sort of the basis for how we thought about our impact measurement approach was, what does the literature say improv can do in the first place? And then what components of our program can we build around that? So we've seen that social anxiety, divergent thinking, and self-efficacy are studies that show that these are 3 dimensions on which improv can directly translate to outcomes. So the question that we ask is, are we able to replicate these things? How can we test for them? And what activities lend themselves well to these things? So one of the pieces I'll focus on here with social anxiety is uncertainty tolerance. But one of the main premises of improv is that you don't actually know what's going to happen next. You're often listening, and you don't even have time to prepare a response until you fully listen to what the other person has said. Then you craft a response. Then you sort of act on instinct and what your character would do, right? And so uncertainty tolerance felt to us like a pretty natural extension of improv. If you're going to spend a lot of time improvising, that should, if done properly, lead to an increase in uncertainty tolerance, which then may lead to better social anxiety outcomes and things like that. Creativity is sort of what we've been using as a proxy for divergent thinking, which is how many different ways can you answer a problem? Can you attack it from different angles? How do you adapt and iterate when necessary? And in improv, things like new choice lend themselves very well to that, where you're immediately asked, okay, you have a solution to a problem, but can you give us a different one? Can you give us another one? Can you give us another one? And then the last one I touched on already, which is just the community and the self-efficacy portion of what you do. So you have to commit to choices, as Thalia had said, and you have to trust in your classmates that you're not going to get rejected. Your gifts in improv aren't going to get rejected. They will be accepted, and then you can build on it. And so this sense of give and take and community is something that we've seen in our classrooms and something that we are working to quantify further. A quick overview of sort of the scope of our program. So this is from our annual report last year. So it talks about from fall 2021 to spring 2022, what was our reach? Who did we serve? The answer is we served around 630 students. 400 of those completed our core 10-week program. You'll notice that most of our students are students of color, and most of our students are also classified as economically disadvantaged. And that's just basically based on the proportion of students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. So this is the population that we're working with. And yeah, before I go to the impact results, these are some of my favorite sort of stories, and I'll just read one of them and then we can keep going. So a student shares, I feel free when I'm doing improv. My mind is not preventing me or hindering me from what I actually want to do. Through Unscripted, I've learned that it is okay to make mistakes, not to overthink things, and to work with your teammates rather than against them. I think this is sort of, when we hear things like this is exactly what we want to accomplish, right? We want students to not second guess themselves, to trust in their classmates when they don't second guess themselves, and maybe they say something that's right or not. And also just develop confidence that can translate to things like raising their hand in class when it's not improv. So one of the main things that we've been using in order to measure our impact is the Bessie scale, which is, like I said, Philip and I had heard so much about, SEL and what it means and how it can be measured. And so we use the Bessie scale as a way to put it all together. This was developed by Dr. Brent Roberts, I believe, at the University of Illinois. And the question that his team was focusing on is, what I mentioned is that there are so many different aspects to SEL. How can you codify it in a way that you're able to say, these are the 5 aspects of SEL that we're targeting. And on these dimensions, we are seeing improvement, or we are seeing strengths. So the 3 that we found are most relevant to improv are social engagement, cooperation, and emotional resilience. And in some ways, we test all 3 of them. So the left-hand side of this sort of impact report piece that we have are just questions that we ask our students. We ask, how do you feel? Do you feel like you can better, communicate? Do you feel like you are more confident participating in class? Do you feel more comfortable with your peers? And then some of these others are the ones that we've pulled from the Bessie scale. So we sort of do pre and post surveys. Week 1 and week 10, we ask students to sort of rate where they fall on things like self-efficacy and rejection sensitivity. And then we test again in week 10, how have those responses changed? And then we say, okay, for 71% of the students, we're seeing a measurable increase on this dimension. So that's currently how we measure impact. It's all self-reported, and one of the things that we've been thinking about is like the Bessie scale is a great way for us to think about a point in time, it might not be the best way to think about changes over time. So that's another question that we have as practitioners of how can we measure change over time over this 10-week program. That is our presentation. I'm happy to share more about any of the above and sort of how we arrived at these things and next steps. But again, thank you so much for having us here. Philip and I were just talking about this. It's incredible that we're here and presenting something when, 3 years ago, we were very new, and happy to share what we know, but also very much here to continue to learn from all of you. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip and Meera. Wow. That is what a beautiful presentation, inspiring work. And maybe the biggest part of the shock of your success is that you started this right at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, talk about having to, I guess, practice what you preach in terms of be open to change and uncertainty. Well, fantastic. Well, thanks to all of our presenters. Now we get into the in conversation proper part of our session. And so, Thalia, I'd like to start with you, if I could, and I'd like to invite you to comment on what Philip and Meera just shared with us. Based on your experience as a researcher, what strikes you as particularly valuable or interesting about the work that they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm so excited about your program and all of that. Actually, I mean, the thing that I think is most important here is that you're going into the classrooms where the students are and not waiting for them to come to you, and that you're inviting them to engage in this program sort of from where they're starting, right? You're not asking for overt showings of interest, and that was true both on Zoom and in person. You're allowing students to sort of meet you where you are and where they are, and then build from there. I think that starting, the beautiful thing of you guys choosing improv and choosing sort of Spolin-based improv is that you can start at this foundational level with these 5 core principles and just bring the students with you at their rate and their interest level. And so I think that this is where programs sort of can rise and fall, or can succeed or fail, is if you're not willing to meet the students where they are, you're not gonna do anything for them, because they're just gonna sort of wander off in another direction. So that is the part for me that, like, that means the effects that you see are going to be based off of like the trajectory of the students and meeting them in their authentic places. So I love that.
Thalia, I think those are great comments. When your presentation, you talked about, when you say theater, it can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so Philip and Meera, again, sorry, but I'm thinking very meta here. Like, they had to be improvisational from the beginning, and they had to make their own choices and commit to those choices very strongly. Again, given the external circumstances, and then even the challenges, ongoing, I'm sure. So Philip and Meera, I'm wondering, I know you said a little bit about this, but I think we're all curious to know, it can seem to us easy to hear you present, like, oh, we're doing this improv, and we're like, whoa, that's perfect, that's great. But how did your thinking about this evolve over time, and how did you land on improv as the form of theater that you would focus on at this initial stage?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think me and Meera grew up in, classroom environments where traditional drama classes. And when we were thinking about how do we bring accessible arts to Philadelphia Public School, we were both working in Philadelphia Public Schools at that time during college. I was a tutor, Meera was teaching financial literacy, and we saw that the student population may not engage in a traditional drama class as we grew up in. And when we thought about, what were the games that everyone in the class did participate in, it was, as, Thalia mentioned, the generation stage of that acting class, the improv part of that acting class, where there's no script, there's no character, you just come as you are. If you want to be the cool kid, you be the cool kid. If you want to be the funny kid, you be the funny kid. And everyone is allowed to be who they are, and will meet you where you are. So that is the reason we chose improv as our method to get across these core techniques for our students. And, for us, it was a no-brainer as a nonprofit. As improv classes, we need no resources whatsoever. We just need bodies in the classroom. So it really allowed us to scale as quickly or as slowly as we wanted as well from a more practical lens. And now we've seen the pandemic comes through, and that the thesis of why improv should be in the classroom is ever more prominent. Teaching kids how to adapt to uncertainty, how to collaborate each other, and to learn how to speak without a script is actually quite a difficult thing to achieve in school. So that's how we landed on improv and why we continue to champion it.
Oh, that's fantastic. So when Thalia was speaking and talked about the generational sessions, I just started like cackling over here in my mind, because I remember being in plays and having that part of the, the warm-ups or whatever, and doing it, and how I was going to say how much fun it is. It was fun, but it was like deeper. It was like, oh my goodness, like I could be a piece of sizzling bacon in a skillet. This is fabulous, right? And it just really opened up places that I didn't know could be opened up and were allowed to be opened up. So I think we could probably spend the rest of our time and much more just kind of going around hearing people's experiences, of these generational kinds of components. So that being such an active, ingredient or an active part of our experiences. So let me now turn to Philip, and maybe beginning with you, Meera. When you were listening to Thalia present the work that she's doing, what was it about her presentation that you think might be particularly useful for your work, or what really was a highlight for you?
Oh, to be clear, I was taking notes the whole time because I plan to I plan to utilize. One thing that in particular struck me was this framework of here's what's happening in a class, all of which I resonated with. So yes, body awareness and control, imagining and envisioning. Yeah, that's actually what happens in our classes. But then that next step is something that I was definitely less familiar with, which is, okay, so what is the effect of that activity directly on the student? So several of our teaching artists are really into music and movement in their classes. And so they use a lot of that to get students warmed up, ready to go. And I'm realizing like warmed up, it is like a physical, mental. So this concept of emotional regulation seems like something that actually would be very valuable for us to test, because we do so much of that work, so much of that movement. Because if students are in a classroom all day and this is the break from their day, we do a lot of warm up and cool down. And I'm curious as to how that sort of affects the bigger picture of what impact are we leaving on these students. So broadly, it's this connection between activity and direct impact, and specifically about movement is an outstanding question that I have. But I really like this framework that you put together, Thalia.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that was so striking to me, actually, when I first started collecting data back in 2017 and 2018, and we did some initial sort of time course analyses, was realizing that half to 3/4 of most classrooms are spent on physicalized and improvised activities, which wasn't really what we were expecting. We were expecting like scene study and rehearsal and performance, right? But the truth is, if you want to learn how to portray an emotion for an audience, and you want to learn how to connect it or disconnect it from your own personal emotional state, all of that is an embodied act. All of that is a physicalized act. And we know from decades of research in mainstream emotion regulation and in the cognitive neuroscience of affect and emotion that if you can figure out your own physicality and learn how to regulate it in healthy ways, that translates directly to emotional health and emotional well-being, which then translates to deeper connections with other children and with other people, right? So there's this cascade of knowing yourself, knowing your physicalized reactions, gathering emotion knowledge, regulation, and then connecting to others. And we see that cascade developmentally, and we can see it in intervention as well. So yeah, the body stuff is like, I can't wait to like start running true experiments on it, because I think it's a key to unlock so much.
Absolutely.
If I could just jump in just really quickly, I know there's been a lot of controversy about power poses about the body. Some of you have heard about, this idea that if you spend 2 minutes in some kind of a power pose, that will make you into a super human of some sort. I think the full, the there's still the jury is still out as to whether there's anything at all to this or whether there isn't. But I have to say, when I read about this, I was both excited and disappointed. I was excited that there was somebody actually looking at the body and the way in which we, that the positions that we have in our body and the communication that gives, to ourselves and to others. But I was also disappointed because, my goodness, boiling down all the stuff that Thalia, you've been talking about when you film these classes, and, Philip and Meera, the stuff, the improvisational stuff, you're going to boil that down into just holding a pose for 2 minutes. I think anybody who's been on a stage or who's been in an acting class or who's wanted to be or something, just oh my goodness, what a tiny, eensy, bitsy little bit of something. And so there's so much more here, right? As you say, Thalia and Meera.
Yeah, I think you've boiled it down to the sort of key reason why those things may not replicate, and why there may be some issues with the sort of P curve in that literature, which is that the way in which actors and performers and improvisers embody emotion and embody communication is contextualized and communicated in a narrative, whether that narrative is one sentence as part of a three-headed monster, or whether that narrative is 25 minutes of Hamlet being performed by your classmates. It's the contextualization of the embodiment that I think this is the beauty of interdisciplinary work. Psychology wants to be reductionistic. The arts want to be holistic. We need to find that balance somewhere in the middle to discover what it's actually happening.
Well said. Well said. Well said. Philip, I want to turn it over to you next. Were there any things about what Thalia mentioned in her presentation that struck you as being particularly useful or interesting?
Yes, I mean, for me, the reason why improv is so important is that it is playful. It is all about play. And I believe there's so much power in play. That's how kids, when they're 5 years old, that's how they learn. They learn through play. And as we enter a school environment, especially kind of a very rigid school environment, which is what, a lot of academic schools are these days, that kind of gets stripped out from education. And, as Thalia mentioned, one of the habits of the mind is that ability to release inhibition, release to trust others. And that is what we see as something holding back on a lot of our students, but also a lot of our corporate clientele that we also serve for our nonprofit. So we offer corporate workshops as kind of a revenue stream for us. We offer them to really high performing, consulting firms, or even like Penn as a university. And we realize the number one thing holding so many people back is that they're just too afraid to raise their hand or to speak up, and they may have a great idea. And that is something that I've always wanted to focus on for our program, because so much of it is that people know the answers, they're just not willing to say it. And that really can, be a barrier for you in your success in your life. So that's something that I've always really cared about. And I'm really glad you mentioned as well, Thalia, in your research.
Thanks.
Terrific. Fantastic. So I want to ask our presenters one more question, but when we're done with this, I'll welcome questions from any of you who would like to chime in on the conversation. So feel free. I see there are a couple of things that have come in via the chat. Feel free to add questions there, or comments or suggestions, or to raise your Zoom hand. And we'll try to get to as many of you as we can before our time expires. So I want to take what may seem like a bit of a leap. I don't know, because we've been talking very carefully and soberly and wisely, I think, about the various components that research may help us to see, connecting theater of various stripes, various types, to well-being and flourishing of various sorts. And I want to talk about, in particular, character. And I want to talk about character because character is so central to acting. It's so central to theater. And so one of the things that we learn in acting is how to develop a character, or how to take on a character, how, in a sense, for a moment, to become someone else, or to become a part of ourselves that doesn't normally get to, be out in the spotlight and so forth. And so when I think about questions of character and, you know, in a moral sense, you know, what kind of this person's character. I think that the experts on character development in any university are the theater folks, it's the actors, because you have to develop character all the time. Maybe the creative writers do some of that too, but it's really, I mean, actors have their full bodies in the game, right? And so there are so many things, I think, including many of the things that we mentioned today, that are important in the process of character development. And in particular, thinking about in a democratic society, we don't just want to force character on people, but we want them to, in an improvisational sort of way and a free kind of way, to decide what kind of character they're going to develop, what kind of character they're going to be as they continue through their lives. And this is especially important for adolescents, because we know that so many of the decisions that adolescents make at this period of, you know, great brain plasticity will be harder to change later on. So I'm just curious to any of our presenters, if you have thoughts about connecting what we typically think of as you know, an aesthetic character or a theatrical character with, you know, on stage, with this character that we all need to think about developing, becoming off the stage.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question, and I think it is one that so the way that I think about it is, one of the things that an acting class and performance sort of requires students to do is to think about psychology from a third person perspective, and to think about emotion, belief, desire, intention, behavior, subtext from this third person perspective, regardless of whether you're about to perform yourself in a act, or whether you're about to perform, you sit and you read about Iago and the terrible things that he said and done. And there are great quotes from multiple actors talking about, like, well, I've never played a villain in my life, because every character I play has their reasons for doing things, has their intentions for doing things. There's a wonderful quote from one of my classrooms. This is at the magnet school. They're doing an exercise where they are talking about the subtext underneath the lines of the characters. The majority of the students in this classroom are African American, and there is one white student in the classroom, and they are playing a scene in which the white student is racist towards the African American student. And the white student's saying, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to say these words. I don't want to engage with this material. And the teacher stands up and says, you need to figure out a way and a reason why you would say this to this other character, how to connect to it so that the audience gets the chance to reflect, and so that the audience gets a chance, so that when this character gets her comeuppance, when she changes her heart, when the rest of the people on stage are able to show her the error of her adolescent ways, that everybody can understand that. And that's how you can start to change people's hearts and minds and understandings and beliefs and intentions, right? And so what this teacher was really trying to convince this student of is, you need to take the third person perspective in order to figure out what's going on and then step into it. It doesn't have to be you reflective of you, but learning how to take that perspective, learning how to step outside and then come back into it again, is how you build the skill of reflection. And that reflection will serve you well across the rest of your life. So that's how I think about it, right? If we're going to develop character and we're going to develop it purposefully, the first step is to take the third person perspective on how we behave and how we act.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Thalia. Actually, in our curriculum in week 6 is point of view, and that's the week we bring in character work for improvisation. And I think the benefit of character work is that there's also nuance in a character. As Charlie said, it's about subtext, about understanding the little differences that make a character tick. In our work, you know, we tell students when we do the class on emotions, emotions go from 0 to 10. It's being angry isn't just screaming your lungs off. It could be anywhere in between. And to understand all of that from a different perspective is about your ability to read someone else. And by that, you understand how human nature works, right? And that is that perspective, that third party perspective is what I think is really key for you to become also a better human being. So Meera, anything to add there?
The only other thing I'll say to this is that I think in our experience, we've found that teenagers who we're working with are both thinking so, and also my personal experience, my sister is 17. Teenagers are thinking so much about how they are perceived by others, but also at the same time may not actually get many opportunities to get the reality of how they are perceived. So they may be thinking like, I'm being perceived in XYZ way, but actually have very few opportunities to know, actually, I'm being perceived in ABC ways. And I think improv and theater is a very valuable way, and it doesn't have to be through improv and theater, but it is a valuable way to sort of see this. So earlier on in our curriculum, we're encouraging failure. We're playing games like loser ball, where the objective is you're throwing an imaginary ball, which you cannot possibly catch. How can you fail in the biggest way? So it's sort of deconstructing this idea that you have to be good on stage, you have to be able to catch the ball. And that's not the point. So maybe the beginning of that is, okay, people aren't judging me the way that I think they may be. But the second piece of it is we play a game called Bus Stop, where the idea is I'm at the bus stop and I'm acting a specific character. Not me, I'm just acting any sort of character. And in my head, I'm thinking these are the characteristics of this person. Philip comes up to the bus stop, and over the course of the minute, he's taking on the characteristics that I am portraying, but he might portray them in a completely different way, or he might have perceived the way that I was acting completely differently than I thought. So maybe I thought I was, chewing my gum really loudly and being really obnoxious and so on and so forth. And Philip doesn't read it quite like that, for example. And I think it's an exercise in, number one, it doesn't matter, like people aren't perceiving me as much as I think they are, perhaps. And number two is also the way that I'm being perceived might not actually be an accurate reflection of reality. So that's my thought there.
Beautiful. Fantastic. Well, thank you. Let's turn to, there have been a few comments and questions coming in via the chat. Tom, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot and invite you to exercise some of your improv skills, although you've already been, thinking and sharing some things over the course of the discussion. You had a couple of interesting questions and suggestions. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just sharing them with the presenters.
Well, it would be absolutely my honor. Thank you. So, Thalia, kind of a nuts and bolts question. How do you measure theory of mind? I mean, as Chen has been teaching it to us, that's like fMRI work. And, how are you doing that?
Yeah, so it depends on the age group. So in my 4-year-olds, I use a scale called the Wellman and Liu Theory of Mind scale. This is basically dog number A knows something and dog number B doesn't know it. And then how do they ask different questions? Or kitten number A has an emotion and kitten number B has a different emotion. Who's likely to act in what way based on which emotion? In my 9-year-olds and my 10-year-olds, I use pictures of people's faces called the Reading the Mind and the Eyes scale that have different emotions around them and mental states around them, and they have to pick which one is the correct one. We also use a task called the faux pas task, in which we tell stories about faux pas and then ask the children to explain why those faux pas happen. Because faux pas happen when there's a disconnection of knowledge and intention, right? Where your knowledge is bad, but your intention is good. And so you behave in a weird way, but you didn't mean to. So that's a theory of mind task. With my adolescents, we use, again, the Reading the Mind and the Eyes task, the adolescent version, which again are these pictures of the eyes that students pick, which is the correct mental state that the eyes are showing. That measure is very reliable, but it doesn't have a lot of good external validity. So there's some questions about whether or not we're going to keep using it. We also use a task, this one is my favorite, it's called the empathic accuracy task. So what this is, it's a film of people having conversations with each other. And then we showed that film back to them after we recorded them. And we asked them, what are you thinking and feeling in this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment? So we have a real-time sort of script of what the people are thinking and feeling as they were having a conversation. In this case, it was a boyfriend and girlfriend having a conversation about the best 5 movies of the last 10 years, right? So there's lots of like micro stuff going on. There's lots of intentions going on. And then we basically ask the students to say, well, what is she thinking and feeling in this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment, and then sort of score them from there. You can't really do a straightforward fMRI study of theory of mind because there's so much stuff going on with the default mode network. It's not like there's a module in your head where you read somebody else's beliefs, desires, and intentions. So we work purely in behavior, not in neuroscience in my lab. But I do think that the behavioral indications of theory of mind are pretty good, particularly as you get into that high school group. We actually find fewer theory of mind effects and fewer cognitive effects as we get younger. We find more emotional effects as we get younger. So we find more empathy and more emotion regulation effects in that 4 to 10 age group, and then more cognitive and theory of mind effects as we get into that 14 to 18-year-old age group. And the professional actors are doing great on theory of mind because it's literally their job. Like theory of mind is literally the job of a professional actor. So they score quite high on both dispositional and state measures of both self-report, but also task reading for theory of mind.
I was specifically interested if any of those are sensitive enough to see like before and after a 6 or 10 week class, do we see changes? And you have seen that?
Yeah, so I would recommend, there's a paper that we published back in 2012 called Enhancing Empathy and Theory of Mind. That was actually a 9-month study. And then there was another study by Debettingis and Goldstein in 2020, which is a 10-week random control trial of improv classes for 10-year-olds, in which we find effects actually in self-efficacy, but not theory of mind. So this is where the sort of replication trickiness of measuring these social emotional outcomes come in, because I think it really depends on the qualities of the acting class or the improv class itself.
Wow, so cool. And for Philip, thank you, that was amazing. I mean, 3 more hours would be almost enough for my curiosity here. But Philip and Meera, I just wanted to know like how you're looking at creativity, and the thing that came to my mind was the divergent association task because it's short and quick and sweet. But Meera, you cracked me up when you thumbed up my question. So does that mean yes, you're already doing it, or you just like the idea?
No, I've heard of it. I've thumbed up because I've heard of it. So when we were crafting our impact measurement for this year, we were working with Pratikshit Pandey, who's a PhD. He was a PhD student. I think he's now finished at Penn in communications at the Annenberg School, and he had sort of shared that was something that we should consider adding to our work. And I think that's something, Tom, quite frankly, we have a backlog of sort of things that we want to test, and right now where we're at just is we serve maybe 400 students a semester. We'll get maybe 200 good responses in the pre-survey, 200 good responses in the post-survey. And one of the main challenges we're facing is, are these the same students who are like, we need to ensure consistent attendance week 1 and week 10 to be able to match the results. Another thing we're thinking about is also just like time in the classroom. So, this isn't answering your question anymore, but the point is, I think one of the things that we're struggling with is, how do we connect like all of this rich data that we think that we can really collect with just the time constraints? Students we right now are reading the questions on paper surveys because we've found that even though that's incredibly low tech, that's just the best way for us to get answers with integrity. But I think what you mentioned is something that has been brought up. Another thing that we would love to bring in is rather than just self-report, how can we include observational data to see how students, so one of the things we're testing is self-confidence or even just speaking confidently. What are measures that we can test before and afterwards, and just add that dimension to our impact. But the thumbs up was because I'd heard of it and Pratisha was telling us we should use it, but we haven't quite yet.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you, Tom. I think we're going to try to sneak one more question in. We're getting close to the end of our time. Krista, I want to turn to you because I know that you are a Penn postdoctoral fellow in the Humanities and Human Flourishing project. And your question is very directly connected to the kinds of things that you're hoping to be able to develop. I wonder if you could just give us maybe a tiny bit of background and then go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Excuse my voice. I'm a little bit sick, but thank you again, Thalia and Meera and Philip for your talk. I learned so much. I felt like I need a theater class after this or an improv class. So I framed my question in a sort of very medical way, this sort of dose response effect, but I asked the question because I do come from a developmental science background, and I know that as in the age ranges that you all work with, there might be plenty of time in order to do these sort of interventions. But as an adult, there might not be as much time to be able to take a 10-week improv class. So I was just wondering what you all thought of maybe the lowest possible dose of these classes could be to have these effects. Do you think that it can be done in a 1-day, 1-hour workshop, or does it need to be over the course of a weekend? I heard 10 weeks come up twice, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts were there.
Yeah, I will say I'm very suspicious of single dose interventions. There have been some published papers talking about single visits to a theater or single visits to a museum or single day exercises. They may find an effect like directly after doing it, but those effects fade. Those effects, there's really no evidence in the literature that like single effects do much of anything. And in fact, they really have problems replicating when they go into more diverse samples. 10 weeks seems to be pretty common. You come from developmental science background. That's a pretty typical intervention length. In a randomized control trial of a 10-week dramatic pretend play intervention, we found significant effects on emotional control 3 weeks after the end of the intervention. In that self-efficacy improv, we found continual effects a full semester after the intervention had ended. Again, though, that was a 10-week intervention. I think the trick with single doses or short doses is this idea of, are you opening up something that is resilient to everything else that is going on in these kids' lives? Because the thing with interventions, particularly for kids who are experiencing multiple systemic oppression, multiple systemic traumas in the rest of their lives, is 10 weeks of improv is great. There's 23 hours and 25 minutes in the rest of the day. So I think every little bit helps, but I think looking for silver bullets is when we start to run into trouble, because then we sort of give up because we don't see grand effects off of one dose. I think continual small doses is always going to be the best thing. And using explicit instruction with students. We know this from executive function interventions, using explicit instruction with students where you tell them, this is how you can apply this skill in real life. This is how I want you to use this skill in the classroom. This is how you think about raising your hand when you're in that class and you don't know what to say. This is how you walk into your next interview. That explicit noting of how the skills you've just spent the last 3 weeks learning can be applied to the outside world is our best bet at making these things last over time. I'm teaching you something that you can now apply over there. But if you're not explicit about that transfer out of the theater world, it's actually quite hard to convince kids to take those skills and take them elsewhere. So we have to be mindful about being very purposeful. You're going to use this in your interview. You're going to use this in your job app. You're going to, right? But you have to teach the skill first, and then you talk about transfer.
Thalia, so helpful. Thank you for that wonderful answer. And I agree. We could, we should have scheduled another 3 hours for this meeting because it's.
We'll have to come back.
Have to come back. Encore. Have to do it again. Fantastic. So I just want to again to express my and our collective thanks to Thalia Goldstein and Philip Chen and Meera Menon for joining us today and giving us such thoughtful presentations and such helpful answers to our questions. The work that you're doing is so important and so inspiring. We can't wait to hear, in another year or how you're doing with all of this, both on the research side and on the application side. As we wrap up, I also want to thank Catherine Cotter, Associate Director of Research, and Sarah Sidoti, Associate Director of Operations for the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, for all of their work behind the scenes for this colloquium. And finally, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us today. It's been great to have you with us. In closing, I do want to mention that we have just published a volume on theater and human flourishing. Don't know if you can see that, but it's part of our book series with Oxford University Press on the humanities and human flourishing. So there's a lot of great content in this volume, Theater and Human Flourishing, if you'd like to follow up with that. Our next In Conversation colloquium session will be on music making and human flourishing. We'll be joined by German researcher Friederike Kohler and local Curtis Institute professor Jonathan Coopersmith. It will begin at 9 a.m. on Thursday, March 16th. For more information on this upcoming session, we invite you to sign up for our free newsletter, which you can do by visiting our website again at www.humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org. Sarah, thank you for putting in the chat both a link to the theater volume and also a link to our website. You can find out much more information at our website about the work of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. Please feel free to pass the word along to anyone you think might be interested. Thanks again to our presenters and to all of you for joining us today for this very rich discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and be well.